Chapter 3, Part 1 of Breaking the Outer Ring, Marine Landings in the Marshall Islands by John C. Chapin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Marine Attack, Roi-Namur. As the amphibian tractors sought to form up in organized attack waves, a series of problems arose. There was a continuation of the rough weather and radio communications difficulties of the day before. The Amtrak crews had not previously practiced with the assault units. The control ship turned out to have been assigned firing missions as well as wave control and left its control station, followed by some stray Amtraks. The attack commander was reduced to racing around in a small ship and shouting instructions through a megaphone. As a result, W hour, the hour for attack, had to be postponed from 1000 to 1100. Meanwhile, the men in the Amtraks, and some in hastily scrounged up LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle, or personnel, were watching the awe-inspiring sight of the furious bombardment. Overhead, for the first time in the Pacific War, 2 Marines were in airplanes to act as naval gunfire controllers who would cut off the shelling when the troops approached the beach. Brigadier General William W. Buchanan later recalled how one of them, on one of his passes, found one of the trenches on the north side of Namur filled with a number of troops crouching down in the trench. So he asked the pilot to go in on a strafing attack, and then as they came over he was going to continue raking them with the machine guns. He did this to such a point that, after they got back to the ship, it was determined that, in the spotter's, enthusiasm, he practically shot off the tail end. Down in the lagoon, the signal finally came to the assault waves. Go on in. The 2 lead battalions of the 23rd Marines headed for Roi, with the 2 lead battalions of the 24th Marines churning towards Namur. The memories of this run-in were burned forever into the mind of young Second Lieutenant John C. Chapin, leading his platoon in the first wave. By now everything was all mixed up, with our assault wave all entangled with the armored tractors ahead of us. I ordered my driver to maneuver around them. Slowly we inched past, as their 37mm guns and 50 cal machine guns flamed. The beach lay right before us. However, it was shrouded in such a pall of dust and smoke from our bombardment that we could see very little of it. As a result, we were unable to tell which section we were approaching, after all our hours of careful planning based on hitting the beach at one exact spot. I turned to talk to my platoon sergeant, who was manning the machine gun right beside me. He was slumped over, the whole right side of his head disintegrated into a mass of gore. Up to now, the entire operation had seemed almost like a movie, or like one of the innumerable practice landings we'd made. Now one of my men lay in a welter of blood beside me, and the reality of it smashed into my consciousness. The landing then became a chaotic jumble of rapid events for that officer and his men. There was a grinding crash to their right, and looking over they saw an LVT collide at the water's edge with an armored tractor, climb on its side and hang there, crazily atilt. Simultaneously, there was a grating sound under their tractor as they hit the beach. Keeping low, the men slid over the side of the tractor and dove for cover, for their LVT was a perfect target sitting there on the sand. The lieutenant was the last one to drop to the deck, and as he sprawled on the sand, the Amtrak ground its way backwards into the ocean. Now the lieutenant faced his first combat in a situation that characterized all the landing beaches. His intensive training stood him in good stead as he took stock of the situation. Being in the first scattered group of tractors ashore, his men had no contact yet with any other unit, so the Japanese were on both sides of them, as well as in front. One glance told him that they had landed on the west side of Namur, 300 yards to the right of the spit of land that their company had for its objective. The long hours of studying maps and aerial photographs had proved their worth. The lieutenant's account continued. My immediate task was to reorganize my platoon, for it was scattered along the beach. The noise, smoke, and choking pall of burnt powder further complicated things. I turned to my sergeant guide, as we lay there in the sand, and asked him where his men were. He started to point, and right before my eyes his hand dissolved into a bloody stump. He rolled over, screaming, "Sailor, sailor!" This was our code name for a corpsman. Bitter past experiences of the Marines had shown that the Japs delighted in calling corpsmen themselves and then shooting anyone who showed himself. Soon our corpsman crawled over and started to give the sergeant first aid, so I turned my attention to more pressing matters. As yet, the officer hadn't seen a single Japanese, even though he was in the midst of them. By now, one of the men next to him gasped, "They're in there," pointing to a slit trench 4 feet away. The Marine raised himself up to a crouching position and hurled his bayoneted rifle like a javelin into the slit trench. There was heavy enemy fire coming at the platoon, but it was almost impossible to determine its source. 10 feet in front of the Marines, however, the Japanese had dug a series of trenches running the length of the beach. Tied in with these trenches were scores of machine gun positions and foxholes, mutually supporting each other, all camouflaged so that they were invisible until a Marine was right on top of them. Accordingly, as soon as the men of the platoon would locate an emplacement, they would deluge it with hand grenades and then work on the next one. The lieutenant's next experience was almost his last. At one point in this swirling maelstrom of action, I was kneeling behind a palm tree stump with my carbine on the deck, as I fished for a fresh clip of bullets in my belt. Something made me look up, and there, not 10 feet away, was a Jap charging me with his bayonet. My hands were empty. I was helpless. The thought that "this is it" flashed through my brain. Then shots chattered from all sides of me. My men hit the running Jap in a dozen places. He fell dead 3 feet from me. Shortly after this, the squad with the Marine officer was working on another Japanese emplacement. He pulled the pin from one of his grenades, let the handle fly off, and started counting to 3. The grenade's fuse was timed to give a man about 5 seconds before it exploded. In the middle of his count, a Japanese started shooting at him from the flank. Instinctively, he turned to look for the enemy. Then something in his mind clicked. "And what about that live grenade in your hand?" Without looking, he threw it and dove for the deck. It went off in midair and the fragments spattered all around him. Groups of Marines were forming now under their own initiative and beginning to work their way slowly inland. It was nearly impossible to keep tight control of the platoon under these conditions, but the lieutenant was moving with them, trying to get them coordinated as best he could, when suddenly he dropped to the ground, stunned. He recalled, "My first reaction was that someone had hit my right cheek with a baseball bat. With the shock, instinct made me cover my right eye with my hand. I then realized I'd been hit. Searing my mind came the question, when I take my hand away, will I be able to see? Slowly I lowered my arm and opened my eye. I could see. Relief flooded through me. The wound was on my cheekbone, just below the eye, and it was bleeding profusely, so I lay there and broke out my first aid packet. After shaking sulfa powder into the wound rather awkwardly, I bandaged my right eye and cheekbone as best I could. The bullet had gone completely through my helmet just above my right ear and left a jagged, gaping hole in the steel. My left eye was still functioning all right, however, so after a drink from my canteen, I started forward again. A little later I encountered another lieutenant from our company, Jack Powers. He had been hit in the stomach but was still fighting. Crouching behind a concrete wall, he showed me a pillbox about 25 feet away that was full of Japs who were still very much alive and full of fight. This strong point commanded the whole area around us and was holding up our advance very effectively. It was about 50 feet long and 15 feet wide, constructed of double rows of sand-filled oil drums. Grabbing the nearest men, we explained our plan of attack and went to work. With a couple of automatic riflemen, Jack covered the rear entrance with fire. Taking another man and a high-explosive Bangalore torpedo, I crawled around to the front and observed for a few minutes. Then we inched our way up to the slit that served as a front entrance, and I threw a grenade in to keep down any Jap who might be inclined to poke a rifle out in our faces. Next, we lighted the fuse on the Bangalore, jammed it inside the pillbox, and scrambled for shelter. The fuse was very short, we knew, and we barely had tumbled into a nearby shell hole when we were overwhelmed by the blast of the Bangalore. Dirt sprayed all over us, billowing acrid smoke blinded us, and the numbing confusion deafened us. In a few moments we felt all right once more, and a glance told us that we had closed that entrance permanently. We worked our way back to where we'd left Jack Powers, and found that he'd managed to locate a shape charge of high explosive in the meantime. Taking this, we repeated our job, this time blowing the rear entrance shut. That took care of that pillbox. Jack looked like he was in pretty bad shape, and I urged him to get some medical attention, but he refused and moved on alone to the next Jap pillbox, where, I later learned, he was killed in a single-handed heroic attack for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor. All over Namur there were similar examples of individual initiative. They were needed, for the island was covered with dense jungle, concrete fortifications, administrative buildings, and barracks. It was difficult to mount an armored attack under these conditions. Meanwhile, the Japanese used them to their fullest extent for cover and concealment. Enemy resistance and problems of maintaining unit contact slowed the Marines' advance. Amidst all of this, a Marine demolition team threw a satchel charge of high explosive into a Japanese bunker which turned out to be crammed with torpedo warheads. An enormous blast occurred. From offshore, an officer watched as the whole of Namur Island disappeared from sight in a tremendous brown cloud of dust and sand raised by the explosion. Overhead, a Marine artillery spotter felt his plane catapult up 1,000 feet and exclaimed, "Great God Almighty, the whole damn island has blown up." On the beach, another officer recalled that trunks of palm trees and chunks of concrete as large as packing crates were flying through the air like matchsticks. The hole left where the blockhouse stood was as large as a fair-sized swimming pool. The column of smoke rose to over 1,000 feet in the air, and the explosion caused the deaths of 20 Marines and wounded 100 others in the area. End of Chapter 3, Part 1.